First, I want to say thank you for coming tonight. I know Wednesday nights when it's 80 degrees are precious commodities in April. So thank you for taking this evening to be together. And we also want to start right off the top with thanking the church as a church for putting in the budget some money to help this trip to happen and to make the cost reasonable for those of us who went. So thanks up front to the church. 11 of us spent a week together in Alabama. And each of us had different reasons for going that related to family or experience or reinforcing things or taking things in a new way. But I think at the core, for most of us, we wanted to experience something as a community and not just do something as individuals, but we wanted to be a community of people that truly faced our history and learned from it, as opposed to places now that want to ignore or hide or refute history. We wanted to go head on into it and learn from it and have it change our hearts and break us and remake us and shape us and compel us to engage in the ongoing struggles for civil rights and racial justice. So our intent was to be an exploratory trip, and the idea is that this would become a part of the regular fabric of the church moving forward. So we hope that that's something that can and will be able to happen. Tonight, we want to report back to the church our experience. And I think I'll say we're all sort of struggling to convey our hearts. You know, we'll speak a lot of words tonight, but what we really hope you hear and feel are our hearts and what God did in us and the impact in us, and we hope that's what gets conveyed tonight. We will give you an overview of what we did and experienced, a snippet of a video from one of the museums we attended that portrays part of the racial history of our country. You'll hear many stories of the impact on us. We'll see if you can pass a voting literacy test or not. And we'll have some time to answer questions, so be thinking of what you want to ask along the way. And then we'll wrap up with talking about where we go from here. Fair enough? All right.
So great to see everybody here tonight. Thanks for coming. I do want to give a quick shout out to our team members who couldn't be here today. Karen, who lives in Florida, and Eugenia Brown, who has been under the weather. Unless she cannot see her. She was thinking about coming, but looks like she didn't make it. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the trip and to give you an introduction of our time there. You'll hear more about many of the places I'm going to describe from others on the team. So we had the privilege of worshiping at the Dexter Street King Memorial Baptist Church, where Dr. King once pastored. And the picture on the right is the team on the steps of the church. We were warmly welcomed by the congregation, and we sang the hymn, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which fittingly is the hymn that's also known as the Black National Anthem. And it was definitely the right song to send us into the week. We strolled Montgomery's Riverwalk and were struck by a timeline they have there of the city's history that did not have a single mention of slavery. You would think that it never existed there. There was a section of the long timeline that had a sign that was about commerce, which has a line about the numerous warehouses that are still standing in Montgomery that used to store, and in the timeline the quote was, cotton and many other important commodities. Someone added a piece of tape that said, that little white dot, you of course can't read it, but it says enslaved people, because that was really the truth of the matter. Yes, they did store cotton, but they also were warehouses for enslaved persons. We visited a number of museums dedicated to different aspects of American history. The Civil Rights Memorial Center is run by the Southern Poverty Law Center, And it's a small but very powerful museum organized along the lines of past, present, and future. The first room you go into is called the Hall of Martyrs, which honors people killed during the fight for civil rights in the 50s and 60s. And they have a second area which shows how the struggle continues today and gives words to Black Lives Matter, to voters' rights, to climate change, and things that are still impacting us today. And in the last area, every individual has an opportunity to electronically sign a pledge, which you will hear about later. And when you sign the pledge, your name appears on this large, like a movie screen size wall, along with the names of everybody else who has signed, that just shower down in a continual loop. That memorial, that Black memorial is a monument with the names of the martyrs that was designed by Maya Lin, who also designed the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. The Alabama Capitol building holds a prominent spot in the city on top of a long hill. It's hard to miss it when you're in the downtown area. The building served for a time as the capital of the Confederacy, and we were all struck by the fact that, again, on the grounds or in the building, there is no mention whatsoever about slavery. Rather, or the fact that the 1965 march from Selma ended there. Rather, there is a large, prominent statue of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, as well as a very large monument to the Confederacy. Team members described the Capitol as antiseptic and lifeless, rather like a mausoleum. The Freedom Rides Museum, another quite small but very powerful museum, set in the refurbished Montgomery bus station, tells the story of the groups of people who fought to challenge the ongoing segregation in interstate travel, despite earlier Supreme Court cases that outlawed such practices. The riders were met with violence and terrorism, but in the face of almost certain physical harm and potential death, carried on and eventually prevailed. There I watched team members, Jean-René and Carl, move about in areas that in not so distant past, they would have been legally and culturally prevented from going in. You see in this picture, there's a black line behind Dee Dee. That was a whites only area for that building. The Rosa Parks Museum has two main wings, and the first wing is experiential, where you ride a replica bus that serves as a time machine. There we are sitting on the bus. It includes a video lesson on the rise of Jim Crow and segregation. And the other wing focuses on the story of the 1955 and 56 Montgomery boycott, the first large-scale demonstration against segregation. And as one team stated, all these things that we had seen made history walk off the page. Each of these sites I've talked about have an important story and tell it really well. But the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum and its sister site, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, stand on their own. The Legacy Museum is a world-class museum chronicling the American history from enslavement to mass incarceration. It showcases the twin threads of white supremacy and Black resilience from the 1600s into our present day. The museum does an extraordinary job of weaving art of all media types to support the telling of the story of the evil that it portrays. They use holograms, they use music, they use sound, film, beautiful works of art in all different mediums. Photos are not permitted in the museum, so we don't have any to show you. There is a book that the Conkles kindly brought that if you want to peruse at the end, you can get a sense about what some of the things that we saw there. One team remarked the Legacy Museum was a brilliant place that tells a horrible story. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice is a second site established by the Equal Justice Initiative. The site is a remembrance to racial terror lynching and its victims. Overwhelming in its scale, it includes 800 6-foot monuments which symbolize each county in the U.S. where documented lynchings occurred. The monuments start at eye level, and then as you progress through the site, they rise higher and higher until at the end they're up above your head. Also through the site are monuments. On the monuments themselves is the name of the county where the lynchings occurred, along with a name of the individual if it is known, or the words unknown, and the date on which a lynching occurred. Some of the monuments only have one name, while many have over 10. The site also includes an area with markers from counties in the U.S. which have acknowledged this racist history by erecting markers in that county which tells the story of the lynchings that occurred there. And then there's a replica monument on this memorial site as well. A beautiful, terrible place and holy ground were some of the team's reactions. We drove 50 miles from Montgomery to Selma. Halfway there, we stopped at a national park site which has excellent information about the 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery. In Selma, we were met by Diane Harris, who served as our guide for our time there. She was 15 years old on March 7th, 1965, the day otherwise known as Bloody Sunday. And she and her brother participated in the march and took refuge in an AME church after the marchers were stopped by law enforcement, pushed back, and brutally pursued and attacked as they went back into Selma. We then watched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge together. On the way back to Montgomery, we followed the route used by the marchers. We stopped by the place the marchers camped the night before they walked to the Selma Capitol. Debbie Kunkel's dad stayed there that night in 1965. One team member noted that the day in Selma was the perfect capstone for our week. We intentionally built in time for fellowship and relaxation. The house we stayed in was ideal for this type of trip. We had morning devotionals every day and a time to debrief each evening. We cooked together, relaxed, played games, we laughed, we cried, and were inspired not to give in to hopelessness for the challenges our historical legacy has left us facing today. We want to show you part of a film from the Legacy Museum to give you a taste of the history we experienced and the quality of the types of things we saw in that particular museum.
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy and granted the slave owner complete power over the black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people.
All the places that we visited, as Martha just gave you an overview, were very, very powerful, same as the story that was told that you just heard from the video. But I wanted to focus my time on one place that was quite personal to me, and that was also very powerful to me, the Equal Justice Initiative Legacy Museum. So visiting that museum was painful, and that's sometimes unbearable. For me, I've always struggled to understand how mankind deviated far from God's will that created all of us, all human, at his own image, as equal. Racial injustice that established the race hierarchy where white people are seen as superior to other races contributed to the writing of one of the darkest chapters of history of mankind. As many of you know, I was born and raised in Africa, in Cameroon. Cameroon is right here in this area that is called the Gulf of Guinea. And when I looked at that map, I noticed that 23% plus 15% of slaves that came to North America came from that Gulf of Guinea. So when I walked into that museum, it became personal, because I thought that some of those people who were kidnapped, chained, and trafficked in North America, some of them may be my ancestors. I don't know, because they came from that area where I was born and raised, where my family still live. So when I walked into that museum, I came across this first image of the ocean waves. It became personal, as I said. I thought immediately of those 12 million people who were kidnapped and forced to come to America. I was totally overwhelmed when I walked through a display of sculpture of African slaves who looked just like me. The violence and the cruelty of slavery was in full display in that room. As you can see, mothers in chains nursing their babies. You can see children next to their parents in chain, with the chain around their necks. The museum, used technology efficiently. They used the technology and art to recreate the condition of slavery that immerse you into the reality of the life of a slave. For example, the site of the museum is an old slave warehouse. We've seen a lot of those houses. They look like this, and that's one of those is the site of the museum. And they were able to recreate in that museum with holographic figures that share first-hand account of being separated from your family, from your parent, from your loved one, for being a slave. So you learn through that museum how human beings were dehumanized and treated like animals or commodities. Family were separated. Warehouse before being auctions as commodities, as I said. So the museum shows that we can draw a straight line between, from the century of exploitation to the social economic inequality that we experience today. And what I left from that place from that museum was we need to educate people so that what I've seen there will not happen again. So I thought that every American should go into places like that to learn firsthand the history of this country, especially the most cruel side of our history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to speak from my heart, so I didn't bring notes today, but I really thank Christ Pres for inviting me to, again, this journey, civil rights journey, because it was very personal to me. My late father grew up in South Carolina and was Presbyterian because of the fact that Presbyterians were abolitionists. And so the fact is that he was educated in the Presbyterian Church, and Presbyterian Church was the reason why he became the man he was in the Presbyterian ministry was. And my late mother was from Mississippi and also dealt with slavery as far as the tragedy of slavery throughout her life and the racism that came before that. Christ Pres told me to talk from my heart about my experience. And my experience, I would say, was definitely the first day when we went to Dexter Avenue Church. It really touched me because of the fact that the hymnals that were in the church were the hymnals I grew up with in my church. Black hymnals. And so, and also my friends also that went the journey with me, they were surprised at the political nature of the minister, but I told them, no, that's the black church. My father gave speeches about Jimmy Carter and probably threatened our tax status at the church, but the main thing was that it really touched me as far as it was a journey to really keep in touch with my late parents and really understand what they went through as they went through the 40s and 50s as far as, and 60s as far as the Jim Crow South. And so I'd say that I don't want to be repetitive as far as my other people that are talking today, but I would say that definitely the thing that I really value about the trip is that, yes, it was all the exhibits were just horrifying. They were demeaning, and seeing people who looked like me suffering. But the main thing about it was that I have to look at the good in this. The good in this is that we as black people are survivors, and my parents are survivors, and so we survived the diaspora. We survived Jim Crow, and so I took it as far as it goes that we need to educate young people more as far as the survival nature as far as the slaves go. Obviously, slavery was an awful thing, but the main thing was that look at the hope as far as it goes. My ancestors did not give up hope. I wouldn't be here right now, right? My ancestors, people who looked like me, did not give up hope. And also people who helped us be free and help us with civil rights have not given up hope. And so the main thing I would say is that don't give up hope. Always look at the fact that the silver lining, and when there's bad things or detrimental things, look at the positivity you can do as far as how to correct the situation. And so that's why I saw as far as Montgomery and Selma. And also, one last thing I'd say is that, my spiritual journey has been difficult in the sense that, when I grew up, when I was a young adult, so the church, I became alienated from the church because of the fact that I really saw the church as more of a Christian coalition, right-wing type thing, and really racist. And so, I really got myself more, people know my background, I've been in politics, against me for many years. And so the thing is that, I, really became disinvolved in the church because I saw the church is promoting right-wing ideology. But then, throughout my life, as far as I came close to the church, and then my parents passed away, really became close to the church. And the one thing is that definitely coming to Christ Pres was feeling at home again, feeling the same as far as the hymns were the same, the service was the same. And so the main thing was that coming back, and then this journey really culminates that journey because of the fact that I was able to celebrate and learn something that was, you would think was secular as far as civil rights, but in, again, the context of spirituality. And seeing that and seeing how my parents and other black people use their spirituality to survive the tragedies of slavery, the tragedy of Jim Crow, the tragedy of civil rights, and tragedies happening right now in this country. And so I thank Christ Pres, I thank everything else, and please, if you have any questions, I look forward to them, and thank you very much.
On Sunday morning, we did attend worship at Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church. In the pew ahead of ours, my heart was captured by a precious child with yellow ribbons in her hair and love embroidered on the front of her little jumper. She was so full of spirit, confidence, and dignity. As the pastor softly sang, "Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart," I couldn't help but wonder how many of us have sung this and then have gone out and supported policies that systematically ripped justice from children, like this child with the yellow ribbons. Thoughts of the child remained with me as we walked the streets of Montgomery and viewed plaques referring to the slave trade only as trading in goods and commodities, never mentioning the tearing of children from their mother's arms, the fracturing of families. In the Equal Justice Initiative Legacy Museum, I trembled at the terrors of the Middle Passage, the hideous dehumanization of chattel slavery, the systemic injustices established during Jim Crow, the maliciously calculated mass incarceration of black males, including minors, deprivation of justice, racial justice, economic justice, climate justice, social justice, healthcare justice, education justice, remains today, determining the future of this precious child with yellow ribbons in her hair. We must face the truth of our history in order to bring justice to her world. We owe it to our children to teach them the truth of their history. And we must learn to live the truth of Christianity.
Many things struck me during the trip, but one I want to focus on that really was just so impactful was to be in Selma and to think about the costliness that was paid for the mere right for some people to participate in democracy and vote. It's stunning for me to recall that in most of our lifetimes, most of us here are old enough that in the 60s, there were so many systemic barriers against black people voting. You had to own property. You had to own property. You had to pay expensive poll taxes. You had to deal with arbitrary times for which you could register to vote. And if there were many black people outside in line, they may just shut the office. And literacy or civics tests that had to be passed. Let's see how we might do with some of these questions. Okay, here we go. A U.S. senator elected at the general election in November takes office the following year on what date? No. No, not the 20th. The 3rd. The senators are seated on the 3rd. How many seeds are in a watermelon? Serious. That's a question on the literacy civics tests. Or holding a bar of soap. How many bubbles are in this bar? Or holding a jar of jelly beans. How many jelly beans are in this jar? Answers all at the discretion of the person giving the test. Name 2 things which states are forbidden to do in the U.S. Constitution. Form alliances with former governments, declare war, coin money, impose duties on exports or imports. We all knew that, right? The Constitution limits the size of the District of Columbia to 10 miles square. Appropriation of money for the armed services can only be for a period limited to how many years? 2. Okay, I love this one. Just picture this in your brain as I say it. Draw a vertical line, in 2 equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is only straight at its spot bisection of the vertical. Now, David Straight has that dead to rights in his brain right now. I think the rest of us probably don't quite so well. Selma was the epicenter for the struggle for the right for black people to vote. MLK and multiple other black leaders and organizations used it as the center place for various marches and protests. And as Martha mentioned, we had the joy of spending a day with Diane, a woman who, at the day of these marches in 1965, was 15 years old. She was there. She had a passion for this, and she kept either sneaking out of the house to participate in the march without her parents knowing, or argued with her parents to let her and her brother go. And I love one of the things she said to us was when her parents said, "Why do you want to keep taking these risks?" She had a simple answer: so that you can vote. A 15-year-old. We all walked over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it really felt like a pilgrimage. Felt like we were walking behind our sisters and brothers of decades ago. And it was a little sort of stunning to us that it's actually not a very wide bridge, and it's got a bit of a peak to it. So if you imagine yourself being one of those people on the front line intending to leave Selma on the way to Montgomery, and you get to the bottom of the bridge and there's a wall of state troopers, and all of a sudden the state troopers start marching on you and inflicting violence, and you turn around and there's thousands of people behind you all trying to escape as well, and you're running up a hill on a narrow bridge and you can't jump off the sides. And we couldn't imagine it. We sort of felt it, but you really couldn't put yourself into that place and time. The first march to attempt to cross the bridge was called Bloody Sunday. 2 days later, MLK led another march where they got to the bottom and the troopers were still there, and they prayed and turned around. And 2 weeks later was the infamous march from Selma to Montgomery, the 54 miles, that was a turning point in U.S. history. After all of these events, finally in '65, the Voting Rights Act was enacted. Selma was the centerpiece of this place. So why was it impactful for me? I think partly because I saw and felt how hard-earned that right to vote was, and I'm watching in the last years us ripping those gains apart. The Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act and states enacting legislation that minimize all of those gains in the '60s. I'm going to keep working for voting justice.
Good evening. My name is Ron Conkle, and I went with my wife, Debbie, on this trip, and I am so grateful to our church and the racial justice team for all the effort that went into this, specifically the leadership team of Karen King, Barb Walter, Dee Dee and Jerome Jones, and Rich and Martha Henderson. Their vision and their planning made this trip possible. Despite the delays caused by a pandemic, in the passage of time, they kept their focus on what our purpose was going to be there and when we were going to go. So thank you. Thank you guys for doing that. Well, as a student of history, I was really looking forward to examining the state capitol. And on Monday, our first day there, we were going to the state capitol. On the front steps of the capitol is where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave his address to the Selma marchers when they arrived. And it's also the very same step as where Jefferson Davis took the oath of office to become the President of the Confederacy in 1861. A plaque is embedded on that spot, and it memorializes Davis's oath of office. But there's no mention of King's historic Selma speech at that same spot. As we approached the building, we saw a large outdoor Confederate monument. We learned that the building now isn't being used as a legislative center. It's being used more like a museum. That the legislative functions have been moved to a building nearby. That's a much larger building, just a few blocks away. But when we walked into the Senate chamber, we saw on the wall a plaque, and it was memorializing the action that withdrew Alabama from the Union on February 4th, 1861. I knew this happened, but it took my breath away when I saw this is the room where it all started. It was a very chilling realization on my part. Well, there are images that remain in my memory of this trip. Two of them strike me as most unforgettable. They are murals painted on the Capitol Rotunda ceiling. They are fiction posing as history. They were painted in 1926 during the racial backlash after World War I. Most notably during this time was the resurgence of the KKK. These two idyllic murals retell a false history both before and after the Civil War. The one on the left is captioned as "Wealth and Leisure Produce the Golden Period. Antebellum life in Alabama, 1840 to 1860. This plantation couple is enjoying their leisure on horseback. Others behind them are enjoying a carriage ride. While on the back of them, on the plantation porch, is a black nanny. You can barely see it, caring for the plantation owner's child. Think about this depiction glorifying the pre-Civil War period. During this time period, the overseas slave trade was banned. But as a result of that ban, the domestic slave trade expanded. Black families were being torn apart in the slave markets just a few blocks from the state capitol. The next mural shows the black workers loading cotton bales at the dockside. It's titled, "Prosperity Follows Development of Resources, Agriculture, Commerce, and Industry, 1874 to 1930. Layered on top of the first one that I saw, when I saw that one, it grabbed me in such a way that this was so audacious. The only labor in this image are smiling black manual laborers. It made me think about what was going on in the 1920s, so reminiscent of the popular 1920s minstrel shows. False depictions of happy black people. But here in 1926, the state's history is rewritten for future generations in these state capitol murals. These images haunted me. They are just a blatant, untrue, official state-sanctioned retelling of history. When I think about how our Wisconsin state capitol has legions of busloads of school kids that come every May to see what our history is here in Wisconsin, I wondered what the school children of Alabama are learning about their history. It saddened me to think that a new generation of children are being exposed to the untrue depictions of life in Alabama before and after the Civil War. However, I am encouraged with all the later stops that we had on the trip. This was at the very beginning of our trip in Alabama. We saw busloads of students at Bryan Stevenson's 2018 Legacy Museum and at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The truth is being told thanks to Bryan Stevenson's work. The march continues.
Bright lights. Hello, friends. My name is Debbie Simon Conkle. I joined the racial justice team after being involved with the Justified Anger class for many years. I wanted to go on this trip because my dad, the Reverend Dr. Carl R. Simon, marched with Dr. King in the 1965 Selma March. Why did he do that? Dad had an amazing history. He was an immigrant born to German parents who were Jewish by birth, but converted to being Lutheran before they were married. In 1936, Dad's attorney father was stripped of all court privileges because of his Jewish heritage. He then died at 56 from natural causes, though my dad always said it was really from a broken heart. Dad's mom, concerned for her son's future, bravely sent him at age 15 alone to England. She visited him there once, which was the last time Dad saw her, and then her letters stopped coming. It was not until almost 60 years later, long after the Selma March, that we learned her true fate, that she had been murdered by the Nazis for a very gruesome purpose. But I'm not going to go into that now. In 1939, at age 17, Dad again traveled alone from England to the United States, and later became a Presbyterian minister graduating from McCormick Seminary and marrying my mom in Milwaukee in 1945. They had 5 children, and I was the first. In 1965, while I was in high school, Dad left his family and a very divided congregation to answer Reverend King's call for the clergy of America to come to Alabama. Dad knew firsthand about the evils of racism. He had to go. At that time, his best friend told him that his wife said to him that if he went, she wouldn't be there when he returned. But our mom bravely supported Dad. Sadly, while there, Dad was brutally assaulted by teenage thugs, but saved by a black cab driver. Sorry. Dad returned to us badly beaten, but very inspired by Reverend King's Selma address and all who marched with him. My sisters and I do a presentation about all of this, from the Holocaust to civil rights, which we gave right here in 2015. I hope that this trip would be an important opportunity to add to our talk. But I admit that because of what happened to Dad, I was a little afraid to go. I knew in my heart that I would be all right, for the trip was so well planned. We were with such good people, and my sweet husband Ron was coming with me. I was still apprehensive, but off we went. We actually knew very little about Dad's Alabama experience. No cell phones back then. We knew that he attended a famous rally, The Night the Stars Come Out, with Harry Belafonte, Peter, Paul and Mary, Joan Baez, and many more. But it was there that Dad and 3 minister friends from Milwaukee were assaulted. We found the area where the rally had taken place, at St. Jude's School. But like so many places that we went to, we were sadly disappointed. There were 2 damaged markers that no longer had pictures. They had either been destroyed or left to deteriorate. There it is. And no mention of the rally at all. Here I am, holding Dad's picture in front of St. Jude's. Later we learned that there was a marker on the grounds in the back, but there were no signs pointing to that from the march route. The rally had actually taken place behind this building, but we didn't know that, and we missed it. We then continued on to the capital city of Montgomery, where Dr. King's famous Selma speech had been given. I held Dad's picture there too. Here are pictures of the day in 1965 from the steps of the Capitol. We actually found someone in that crowd picture that kind of looks like my dad. Of course, we can't be sure. How did it feel to be there? Much like when I visited where my grandmother was murdered in France, I felt the same closure, but I was also very sad. While in Selma, our guide, Diana Harris, told us that schools there are now just as segregated as before. Dad would be devastated by this. She then meekly mentioned that at least the faculty was integrated. White flight continues even in the heart of the civil rights movement. While there we saw very few local white people. I had wrongly assumed that we would see integrated cities, but no, it's all mostly for tourists. We saw lots of white tourists. My main observations and conclusions come down to this. Unlike Germany, which truly owns the Holocaust, many in our country are trying to disregard our hideous past and now to actually negate it, even in the heart of the civil rights movement. Thank God for Bryan Stevenson and the Legacy Museum and for all the other moving and haunting museums that we saw. Thank God. Black Lives Matter. The march continues.
Hi, I'm Mary Brott, and I had the privilege to join our team going to Montgomery and Selma. I don't express my thoughts often, or very deeply usually. But as I try to express my thoughts, my emotions, my feelings about the learning that occurred through our trip to Montgomery and Selma, I found myself thinking about laments as we did read from the Book of Lamentations in our reflection time, and also the word pain that seemed to be interwoven throughout what we saw on our journey. Because I wanted to use a new technology, I checked in with chatbot GPT and asked, how does pain and the civil rights movement intersect? And from a robot, automated answer, it came, during the civil rights movement, pain can refer to both physical pain, such as the violence and physical abuse endured by activists who sought to break down racial barriers and emotional pain, such as pain of being discriminated against or watching people who look like you suffer from discrimination. Pain was a shared experience among Black Americans, and it fueled the drive for justice and equality. It inspired people to take action, to speak up, and to fight back against oppression. Pain was also experienced by white Americans who were uncomfortable with political and societal change and the loss of privileges that came with it. The pain of the civil rights movement highlighted the disparities and injustices in our society that still exist today. As I said, that was from a computer-generated response. On our visit to the Legacy Museum, I will share my personal and emotional responses. There were 4 areas at the Legacy Museum which identified things that I saw as pain. I will read parts of my lament as these areas are manifested in my thoughts. The lament of pain. The pain felt then is still pain felt today. The pain of the past does not stay in the past. It becomes the pain of the present. Imagine the pain felt then and how it feels today. Is it any different? What was past is still present. The first area we entered into the Legacy Museum was the kidnapped area, where we were told 12 million people from Africa were kidnapped during the transatlantic slave trade, and we heard some about that. So to continue, the pain of being abducted onto a ship, so painful you may not live. The pain of being sold, the pain of being owned by white people, because your skin is black. Can you feel that shame and pain? The pain of the past is still painful in the present, our today. The second area was called terrorized, where 9 million people were terrorized, 9 million black people were terrorized by the threat of lynching. And I continue again. There is pain in the sacrifice to be free and to stay free. Invisible boundaries continue the pain. Visible boundaries continue the pain. The pain continues with the lynchings. Dramatic lynchings, painful lynchings, heart-wrenching lynchings, broken heart lynchings, lynchings breaking the hearts of families, death by lynching. Where is the justice? Whites inflicting unimaginable pain onto black people for wanting to be free, to be able to stay free, still shackled by the color of their skin. Pain in the past, pain in the present. We continue on to the area highlighted by segregation. 10 million people, African American citizens, segregated. Laws were made to separate. Laws were made to divide, to segregate out of fear. The pain of the red line that divides, the pain of division, separate neighborhoods, separate the blacks from the whites. Why is being black so painful? Why is being white so painful? Why is equality so painful? Why is inequality so painful? And we finish the museum section with the incarcerated area, where 8 million African Americans are under criminal control. So we've moved through the pain of death by lynching into the pain of incarceration and into the jails. The pain of incarceration multiplies. More black than white, again and again. Pain is there, and there is pain. Same but different, different but same. So let me continue with my closing lines and my lament of pain by seeing how we're going to go forward. To continue the journey to be free, to be fully free from the pain of the past, into the glory of freedom, freedom for all, freedom for you, freedom for me, freedom for all. The march for freedom continues. The march continues towards freedom, freedom for all, free from pain, free at last. Yes, Lord, we are free at last. And so to stay free, we must all vote. We must vote to keep it so. We must vote to change the laws. We must vote for all to be free, so freedom can be for all. Thank you.
Thanks for your patient listening. We're hitting the home stretch here. Eugenia was going to speak tonight, but she wasn't able to be here. And she was going to speak about a move toward activism and how this has been a part of her journey, and this has motivated her forward. And I'm just going to say a couple quick things. I heard there was something I really appreciated in this last week. I heard from author Isabel Wilkerson on a podcast, and she said, laws matter. Laws really matter. But laws that were made in the 60s haven't really solved the issues. And I'm talking about the laws in the 1860s, the constitutional amendments that granted rights, much less the laws of the 1960s. She wrapped up by saying, in addition to laws, we people need to stand up and make a difference. And at the Southern Poverty Law Center Civil Rights Memorial, we were given the opportunity to sign this following pledge. By placing my name on the wall of justice, I pledge to take a stand against hate, injustice, and intolerance. I will work in my daily life of justice, equality, and human rights, the ideals for which the civil rights martyrs died. We joined 500,000 people who have signed this pledge. And whether it's this wording or something different, my hope and prayer is that we will all live our lives as activists with the intent of these words close to our hearts and our actions. So we have a couple clipboards that we'll be passing around, and we have handouts with Mary's full lament, this quote, the civics test. But on this clipboard, what we're inviting you to is one of three options at the moment would be if you have an interest in joining the racial justice team, and that team is the leadership team. We meet once a month. There's work to be done in between times. This is the group that's shaping the direction of racial justice for Black in our church. So if you want to be talked to about potentially being on that team. We've also just recently created an email listserv, so if you want to get emails from us once or twice a month, then you can check that. And then if you have any interest in potentially being on a trip like this in the future, you could check future trip, and we'll keep in touch with you as other trip plans come into place. It's not a commitment at this point. No, it's not a commitment. It's expressing interest. Martha's going to close us off.
So I wanted to close us off by reading I'm going to read a quote that was at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And here's a picture of where it appears. I'm not expecting that you can read it. For the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. With faith, because we will overcome. Yep, we wanted to send you out with a rendition of Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Something to it. Just encourage you. We'll take you to church later. Let's go. We'll keep marching, fighting till the victory is won. To all the brothers out there. Hold your head up, brother, till the victory is won. To all my sisters in the struggle. Keep believing, sister, till the victory is won.